Simon Armitage's poem Remains gives us an intense look at the psychological aftermath of war, and is part of the Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. This video will cover everything you need to revise for your exams, including themes, comparison to other poems, and key quotes to memorize. Let's start with a brief summary of the poem so you know what it's about. Through a conversational monologue, a soldier talks about a violent event that continues to haunt him long after it happened, revealing that the casualties of war are not limited to the dead, but also the people that have to live with the memory of it. This poem was written as part of Armitage's 2008 collection, The Not Dead, which was inspired by real accounts from real soldiers who served in modern conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. These men suffered from some pretty horrific psychological trauma after returning home, and the poem Remains, in particular, strips away the heroism that was historically associated with conflict and instead focuses on its human cost. At this time, there was a growing awareness and understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and Remains definitely reflects that, even in its language and structure. Written in present tense, it is structured like a dramatic monologue in order to give a raw and unfiltered voice to the soldier's experience. Unusually, the poem starts media res, or in the middle of the action, to highlight that he is having a flashback and to mimic the confusion and unpredictable nature of conflict. The first-person perspective allows us to see the violent event through his eyes, almost like he is in a therapy session and is talking through his past trauma, as the only voice in this poem is his. The poem is written in free verse, without a consistent rhyme scheme or meter, to amplify this effect, making us feel like we are in the speaker's mind amidst his fragmented memories and flashbacks. You might notice that there is a lot of enjambment, or the carrying over of a sentence to another line or stanza, and this has a couple of effects. One, it propels the narrative forward, carrying on immediately from the media res start, and giving the whole poem a fast, chaotic pace. And two, it represents how the violence he committed carries over into his life, long after the event took place. Armitage also uses caesura, or pauses in the line, to conflict with the enjambment at key moments, like here, to indicate where the memories and the horror should stop, only they don't. The language used in this poem is also very telling of the soldier's mental state, starting off quite matter-of-fact and detached in the first stanzas, and using the opening phrase, "on another occasion," to suggest that events like these are routine occurrences, one of many. His style of speech is very conversational and casual, using phrases like, "legs it up the road," and "one of my mates tosses his guts back into his body." This informal way of speaking contrasts rather disturbingly with the horrific actions he is describing, and emphasizes how soldiers have to normalize these violently traumatic events and dehumanize both the people they have to kill and themselves in order to survive. As the poem progresses, however, the language becomes more fragmented and emotional, showing how the soldier's composure unravels under the weight of his guilt. The words blink, sleep, dream, and close my eyes in close succession blur the boundaries between reality and memory, a symptom of PTSD. The last two stanzas are one continuous thought, full of combined words and alliteration to highlight how constant his torment is and how it follows him everywhere he goes. This brings us to our first theme, guilt and responsibility. By guilt, I mean the individual guilt of soldiers within these conflicts, which repeatedly comes up in this poem. The repetition of the phrase, "probably armed, possibly not," highlights his uncertainty about whether his actions were justified. Soldiers are trained to treat everyone in scenarios like these as potential threats and dehumanize them in order to survive, and that is why the soldier in this poem doesn't call anyone by name. Both his fellow soldiers and the looters are completely faceless. However, his guilt forces him later on in the poem to rehumanize the man he killed, as he sees his face over and over again. A common symbol of guilt is blood, and we can see this in the image of the blood shadow on the street that is both a literal reminder of the act and a representation of the memory and guilt that haunt the soldier. The final line of the poem reinforces this, with the repetition of bloody acting as both a slang curse word, because he's angry that he cannot forget and move on from the incident, as well as a reference to blood on your hands, a phrase which means you are responsible for someone's death. This brings up some difficult questions about guilt and responsibility in conflict. This soldier feels like he has blood on his hands for the life he took, but is he really responsible if he was ordered to do it, and would be punished if he didn't? Or should he take responsibility anyway, because he's the one who pulled the trigger? Regardless of personal opinion, however, the sad reality is that it is the soldiers who have to live with the trauma and horror of conflict, while those giving the orders may have figurative blood on their hands, but don't have to carry the memories and guilt. This carries over into the next theme, which is the psychological effect of conflict. Armitage presents war as extending far beyond the battlefield, with the soldier's trauma manifesting when he's at home on leave, through intrusive dreams and memories. He says, the drink and the drugs won't flush him out, which exposes how soldiers have to use these coping mechanisms to try to silence the images in his head and self-medicate because they are not properly supported after coming home from war. Linking this to PTSD, which was being recognized more openly at the time this poem was written, it explores how this trauma can trap you in your memories and make you feel isolated and alone. As he recalls the same memory over and over, the soldier's perspective seems to change, as at first he shares the guilt with his fellow soldiers, mentioning myself and somebody else, all of the same mind, and three of a kind, to shift the blame and emphasize the collective nature of their actions. Later, however, he doesn't mention the other soldiers, and puts more and more blame on himself until it is just him, holding his bloody life in his bloody hands. Remains shares thematic similarities with many other poems in the Power and Conflict anthology, especially those which explore the psychological and emotional consequences of war. Older poems like Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade are a good contrast comparison, because they tend to glorify war by painting the soldiers as brave heroes and their deaths as noble sacrifices for duty and patriotism. However, Armitage takes away the whitewashed heroism of conflict and shows the mental toll behind it, and the difference is clear even in the structure of the two poems. Tennyson's is rhythmic and orderly, while Armitage's free verse is chaotic and unstable, to question and humanize the reality of war instead of glorifying it. In Ted Hughes' Bayonet Charge, the raw panic and confusion of warfare is also highlighted through media res and a chaotic rhythm and structure, but it is approached in a different way. Hughes captures the immediate physical terror of a soldier charging towards the enemy, while Armitage focuses on the aftershock of the chaotic violence. Similarly, Wilfred Owen's exposure shows the parts of war that are not always highlighted, as his soldiers are emotionally assaulted by the calm before the storm, waiting for the fight to begin while being exposed to the elements. The phrase "nothing happens" is repeated throughout, to emphasize that the fear and mental toll of war isn't limited to the actual conflict, but often surfaces in the mind in moments of quiet, just like Armitage's soldier in Remains, who suffers from PTSD even though he is safe at home. Carol Ann Duffy's War Photographer is another great comparison poem, as both explore how those who witness violence and suffering have to carry the emotional weight of it. Duffy's photographer is haunted by the 100 agonies in black and white that he captures, while the soldier in Remains relives the image of the looter's death in his blood shadow. Both poets use imagery in the photograph and the bloodstain to symbolize how the guilt and horror of conflict live forever in the memory and cannot be erased. And while Duffy's poem criticizes how quickly society moves on from hearing and seeing these stories from a distance, Armitage's poem focuses on the soldier's solitary guilt to make us think about responsibility and how the soldiers are left with PTSD, while those who gave the orders probably didn't think twice about it. So now you know everything you need to revise Remains, but don't forget to watch my other videos in the Power and Conflict anthology linked below so you can get the best grades in your exams. See you next time!